Could you guys, okay, cool. So good afternoon. There's nothing I'd rather be doing today than being in this room with all of you. Today I'm going to be covering what I believe is a fundamental flaw of software projects. But first I'd like to tell you a story about architecture. And it's not the architecture that you might be thinking about. It actually has to do with the bridge and building stuff with steel and metal and wires. Here's this big multi-million-dollar bridge that took engineers a long time to do and build, and the damn thing failed. Why did it fail? Well, clearly it wasn't built very well, but after looking at it, I realized that there was a real problem. And when I stopped and I looked at the problem, it was lack of communication. Those that saw an issue and those that knew there was a problem, there was no way for them to communicate with those that were in charge. So to put it simply, the bridge failed for one reason and one reason only: poor communication. Excuse me. Just like the bridge, communication is a major factor for software bugs. So if requirements aren't defined initially, software depends on communication between stakeholders, development team, and the testing teams. Unclear requirements and erroneous communication lead to software bugs. Defects are introduced in development stage if a developer isn't really clear on the requirements, and those could lead to errors. And additionally, imagine a case where a developer is writing requirements, and it could lead to a situation where programmers would have to deal with problems that aren't clearly understood. In fact, communication overheads is a reason for Brooks' Law. And Brooks' Law states that the more people you have added to a late software project makes it even later. So for example, if you're adding another body to a project, that person isn't going to be 100% productive because they have to be ramped up and trained. And if they're training, then somebody else is actually teaching them, which means that both of them aren't 100% productive because one person's devoting 50% of their time to teaching that person, and the other person is devoting more than 50% of their time to being taught. Fred Brooks also said that 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month, and that was from Brooks' Law. Another point of Brooks' Law was that communication overheads do increase the risk of failure because the more people that you have working on a project, the more chances of failure. And additionally, everyone working on the project, people are working on the same task. They all need to keep in touch with one another and see what they're doing. And if they're doing that, then they have to spend more time for every person being added to a task to sync up to one another, which takes them away from working on that task and the project. I believe that communication is one of the biggest reasons that software fails. And today what I'm going to talk about is how we could overcome some of those challenges. Communication is a problem, but I'm going to show you some strategies, especially when it comes to defect resolution for fixing those problems and to overcome it. It's human nature to pay more attention to visual aids. In fact, the brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. Additionally, 90% of what we process in our brains is visual, and I'm a believer of using visual aids and images when it comes to writing defects and defect resolution. Because at its core, when you're building a product and people are getting all the tickets, you've got a funnel and a backlog of tickets coming in. So what that means is if you're using an image, any information that you're communicating is better communicated with an image. And at the same time, it also means that you're adding more value quicker. So it's very important to attach images to a ticket. Something I do often. I'll attach it to stories, tickets, bugs, or defects. And not only an image, but at the same time, think of Twitter where you have 140 characters to tell your story, to say what you want. If you're writing a subject, like any other ticket, make sure that subject is short and to the point, because the first place that engineer is going to see that is in their inbox. They're not going to see it in the defect resolution system that they're using. They're going to see it in their inbox. And they're going to prioritize what looks easy. And if you have an image, absolutely, yeah, they're going to prioritize what looks easy because they probably got another 10 or 20 tickets coming in during the day from different stakeholders, from product team, who knows you. And their tickets may not be as accurate or as simple. It might just be a lot of tickets with a lot of words. So images is also a common language that all stakeholders understand. and it's easy for them to understand, and that way there won't be any miscommunication. It is challenging, but it saves a lot of time. And thinking about what happens actually does save a lot of time when the ticket goes back and forth. And one of the things that I actually really like to do, and my stakeholders do now, is if a ticket's gone back and forth about 3 or 4 times, I tell them to close it out, because that's like writing an email. If it's gone back and forth 3 or 4 times, before you close it out, pick up the phone, don't write an email, pick up the phone and talk to your stakeholders, or walk over to them wherever they're located and find out what the issue is, and then modify the ticket. But not modify the ticket, write a new ticket, because what's going to happen is as people are looking at those new comments and the tickets going back and forth like an email thread, they're going to get lost again. There's a reason those comments are happening. You want the ticket to get closed out fast. So write a new ticket, work on the subject. If you need to, attach visual aids, get a consensus, and then when you're done with that, list in the description that you closed out this previous ticket for traceability. And then after you've submitted that ticket, you're going to have your new ticket number. Add that ticket number to the ticket you're going to close and say, closing out, please reference this new ticket number. And it'll guarantee you that ticket will be fixed probably relatively fast. So that is important for tickets and bugs and defects. One thing that computers do better than humans is they process math computations much easier. And in 1994, an entire line of CPUs of Intel chips were released with an erroneous bug to the 9th decimal point. Intel initially knew about the issue and they figured no one would see it. So they didn't do anything about it, and eventually their power users realized that there was an issue because they got the blue screen of death. And then Intel said, hey, you have to prove to us that this doesn't work. But eventually they conceded and replaced that microchip for anyone that had a problem with that. But the moral of this story is that shortcuts lead to long delays. And I'll tell you a story about a shortcut that I had that led to a long delay. Last year, I worked on a system for a bunch of casinos, and there was something in engineering called shared components, where you write code, it makes sense on paper. You don't want to waste anything, so rather than write 10 functions for 10 different areas, if you could write one function and have 10 different areas of your system reference that, that's a shared component. It's also a shortcut. So what happened last year was we deployed this code, and it had to do with contact forms on 3 different domains. And it was an adaptive website, so along with 3 different domains, we had 3 breakpoints. And this was controlled through Umbraco CMS system. And what happened over here was everything was awesome, it worked out, but when I saw a bug with one of the forms, after talking to the engineers, I realized that when it was time to validate it, I needed to go check 9 other places. So instead of like checking one place, I needed to go make sure it didn't happen in 9 other places, because each website had a different layout for smartphones, tablets, and desktop, and at the same time, there are 3 different domains controlling this. So it's really important to understand that shortcuts lead to long delays. And another thing, last year, in the United States, there's a big issue with health insurance. So last year, the government launched a website called Healthcaregov, and after investigating why it didn't work, when it launched last October 1st, they realized that through testimony in Congress that it didn't work because testing only started 2 weeks before it was deployed. So this is another example where shortcuts led to long delays. In fact, executives of the main IT companies testified that testing didn't start till 2 weeks before. And then just last month, Apple pulled a release. After launching iOS 8.0, they pulled iOS 8.0.1 after an hour and a half. And the reason they pulled it was because people lost their cellular connection and it dropped connectivity and broke their iTouch. So here's a company that always gets it right, and they're really good with user experience, they're really good with design, and they would put their users through such a horrendous experience with this update. And what was the fix? The fix was rolling it back. But we all know how difficult it is to roll back software. There are actually 8 steps to roll back this software. Talk about inconvenience and an even longer delay. The first 4 steps was to download the firmware from Apple, and then to turn off the Find My iPhone functionality, and then connect the desktop to iTunes. And then the fourth step was make a local backup using iTunes. There were 4 more steps, but one step caused the whole issue, and 8 steps were needed to roll it back. So shortcuts lead to long delays. In software development, you really need to fail in order to succeed. And you need to locate any failures before it reaches production and communicate that, and hopefully things will be resolved. But if you try and fail, it's a good thing, because you're testing out what works, you're testing out what doesn't work. And you need to adapt and learn and move things forward. So it's really good to try and fail and test things out and question everything. But real, true failure is really not doing anything. So if you're sitting on your ass eating popcorn, you're not going to get anywhere. If you try nothing, you learn nothing. You haven't done anything. You haven't questioned anything. So get off your ass. Do some work. You know? Thanks, Joe. So I think failing is awesome, by the way. And I'll tell you a time just last year where I fell on my face and what I learned from it. I was working on an assessment tool for a skincare product, and they gave me about 22 pages of user flows and information architecture. And so basically the user would have to fill out this form, this assessment tool, based on their skin type and their age. They would be recommended a couple products out of 500 products. After 2 weeks of writing this in a matrix and telling my story and linking all these bugs and defects, I realized that the story I was telling could have been better. And I called the product owner and I said, look, I have to start all over. I'm wasting my time with this. There's a better way to do that. That's what happens when you question everything, when you try and fail, when you have an open mind to adapt and learn and move forward. And success also means experiencing failure without fear in order to arrive at something that works. So in Chicago, where I'm from, there's I work out of an incubator, a startup incubator called 1871, and it has about 250 companies. It's a shared space. It's in a place called the Merchandise Mart. And a couple of years ago, I started working there, and I said, wow, you guys have 27 conference rooms. How are you managing that? And they had a bunch of sign-up sheets, and I said, this can't be possible. This is a tech incubator. So I did some research, and I downloaded this program that was open source called Meeting Room Booking System by SourceForge. It gets downloaded about 1,000 times a week for people to reserve tables at restaurants, to reserve airplanes at airplane hangars. And I studied it for about a month, and I adapted the code. And after 30 days, I pitched it to 1871, and I said, hey, I think I got this thing working. Let's use this to manage all this data. So it was cool. It worked. No problem. I built about 10 different environments for them. And then what happened, the University of Chicago basically called me through 1871 and said, hey, we're opening up this innovation exchange, which opened up last October. And could you build this for us? And I said, sure, I'll build it. No problem. I previously built it on a shared server, which was my staging environment. And after the shared server, I had to write tickets for the hosting provider for 1871 because I didn't have access to the database. But it was no problem. It worked. It worked after 3-4 hours. This should be easy. So when it came down to work with the university, there were processes and environment I wasn't familiar with. And the first obstacle that we had to do with firewall, not being able to see the virtual environment. The second obstacle had to do with the database. In short, on October 7th, this place was going to open. The day before it opened, it still wasn't working. So what I decided to do was buy a new domain that sounded like their .edu education website and redirect their .edu education website to my staging server. And we built it off of my staging server. A week later, it worked. We're able to operate on the university system after exporting the data from MySQL. So that was another case where you have to fail and experience. But don't be afraid to experiment, because that's the whole core of testing. And if you're questioning and experimenting and breaking things, things are going to work out. If you're out at the pub having a drink, just test. Take out your phone, look at it. because there's no better testing than being human. Your consumers aren't testing your website through requirements, and they're not biased from documentation and requirements and what should I do here, or this is expected result and whatnot. Your consumers want to know, does this feel good for me? And if you're at the pub, then why not? Don't feel like you're working. Feel like you're in a natural environment. If you see something nowadays with smartphones, you can just pick it up and do a screenshot, and don't even have to worry about working and logging that ticket. You could do it the next day when you wake up or after you're hungover in a day or two. But at the same time, the reason you want to take a screenshot is because images are worth, a picture is worth 1,000 words, just like the brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. Another thing you could do with URL queries, one thing that I really like to do is if you're working on a system, take those URLs and copy them into another document, especially if it has an admin and a login, and then drop that into another website where you haven't logged in and start manipulating the URL. Look for broken custom 404 pages or server pages. You might trigger an error because if you're working on an application, the thing that's happening with the applications is you're always getting a server response. If you're getting that server response, you got to manipulate something. It doesn't have to be clicking a link. It doesn't have to be typing the URL. It just has to be a response. But when you have the URLs off of these paths from admin logins and whatnot, then you know what to build off of and manipulate things. And that's a really good way to do exploratory testing. And you'd be surprised how many bugs I find out that way. Because people that build these systems don't expect anyone to reach those URL paths, but you could still reach those paths if you copied it from another browser, as opposed to just clicking it like the application was designed. So it's not the process, but the product. And this is something I really believe. It doesn't matter what someone's doing, if it's Agile or Scrum or Kanban. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what people want to do is they want to see that the product works and that it works properly. That's what they're going to remember. So last year, Mazda actually had a recall of a bunch of cars because a certain yellow sac spider had a penchant for gasoline and would crawl into the engine and weave a web. And it would weave this web, and then engine pressure would potentially increase, and that could potentially cause a leak in the engine, which could cause a fire. Now, none of this actually happened, but it's a good example of it being the product, not the process. Now, the really cool part about this is Mazda actually had a software fix, an update, and the update was so the bug wouldn't win over the increased engine pressure. It actually prevented the engine pressure from going up just in case the bug was inside weaving a web. So this is a really good example of it's not the process but the product that matters. And then we have Apple again. Just this last month with the iPhone 6 Plus, Apple insists that only nine iPhones penned at this point. And they managed to piss off a bunch of their users. So there's a website right now that's oneofthe9.com. And I looked at it yesterday, and it was 399 of the 9. Like 399 cell phones that people submitted anonymously that were bent. But Apple still insists officially that only 9 cell phones were bent. So it's definitely not the process, but the product ultimately that matters. And this is also called a black swan, by the way. Things that are out of your control that impact things severely. Oh, sorry. One more thing. I apologize. So next thing I want to show is actually a clip from a movie called Ratatouille, and it's at the end of the movie, and there's a critic, and he's giving his critique. And if you pay attention, you see what's happening. The critic's actually the tester, but in this case, the whole theme of the movie is it's not the process also, it's the product. And in this case, the rat replaced the chef because the chef was gone. And the critic was like, well, I want to meet your chef, what's going on? And he was shocked when he realized that it was a rat, but ultimately gave him a very good review. So let's take a look.
In many ways, the work of a critic is easy. We risk very little, yet enjoy a position over those who offer up their work and themselves to our judgment. We thrive on negative criticism, which is fun to write and to read. But the bitter truth we critics must face is that in the grand scheme of things, the average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so. But there are times when a critic truly risks something, and that is in the discovery and defense of the new. The world is often unkind to new talent, new creations. The new needs friends. Last night I experienced something new. An extraordinary meal from a singularly unexpected source. To say that both the meal and its maker have challenged my preconceptions about fine cooking is a gross understatement. They have rocked me to my core. In the past, I have made no secret of my disdain for Chef Gusteau's famous motto, "Anyone can cook," but I realize only now do I truly understand what he meant. Not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere.
So not anyone could become a great tester, but a great tester could come from anywhere. In 1998, I got a phone call from a good friend of mine, and he was leaving his job, and he said to me, "Hey, Shaq, do you want to work this night job?" I was a full-time student in university engineering, and I couldn't get a job because I was working during the day. And I took it, and it ended up being a company called America Online. And the job was watching sports data feeds all night because games were played at night between like 6 at night to 2 in the morning across all the time zones in the US, and analyzing the data and checking the box scores and the recaps. And that's how my career started. So it's really pretty cool, I think, that like there's no real path to getting into testing and quality assurance or whatever name people want to delegate for that, but anyone could really do it. And this field really needs more testers. If somebody hates their job, go test, because we need subject matter experts. We need that. There's technologies today that didn't exist 10 years ago. There's platforms, there's consumer electronics, and this thing is only exploding right now exponentially with all the opportunities with technology. And it's an incredible time to be a tester. We are in the golden age of computer science. Just like I said, there's more opportunities, there's more environments, there's more things to test, to view beautiful, amazing experiences and tell our stories. So thank you all for joining me this afternoon at Agile Testing Days. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Questions? Do you have questions? Questions, guys? No questions? Yeah, questions. Okay.
Takes a while to think sometimes.
Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Do you recommend that companies work on achieving rapid rollback before they work on rapid deployment?
Like Apple?
For example.
Yeah, I think that there should always be, there should be an option, like a plan B. So, you know, as a company like that can't not afford it. They should have a rollback. I mean, that's the paradox. They're built on an amazing user experience and design, but it didn't work out, and it's really not the first time. That happened a couple of years ago with their antennas, with Bengate, and actually, I think before that with maps, with their map functionality. So absolutely, I think that it would help. I don't know how they test those things. Thank you.
Hey, so I've got a question. So when you said you were speaking about failure being awesome, and I agree that we can learn a lot from failure, but I've seen misconceptions where companies then don't try and prevent the failure, they just let it happen. So I'm wondering what your experience would be to get around those misconceptions.
Companies don't try to prevent what?
Yeah, so they'll have an attitude where it's okay to fail, so just let failure happen, and then we'll fail quickly and
To
learn
launch
from
bugs
it.
in production?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So essentially to try and prevent the failure in the first place when you can see that it's going to occur. So
I think it depends on what the product is in the company. So, you know, if it's a broken browser and you look at your data and your data tells you that nobody's on your website at this browser, then it may not be cost effective to fix it. But I absolutely believe that outside of the company making a decision or not whether something should be fixed, as a tester, you're always telling a story, you should absolutely log it and let them decide the priority, if it's risk management or not, because that way you're also not really getting defensive, but protecting yourself and saying, I identified this, it's in your hands.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of process failure. So trying to implement a process within the organisation, and if you see that that's not going to work, but some people might think that failure is okay in the sense of, well, when it fails, then we'll fix it quickly. That's just based on experience, but so yeah, I was just looking for your input on that, but that
Okay.
helped.
Thank you.
More questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.